To be fair, realistically, the US government doesn't just rob American citizens in order to finance itself. It robs the entire planet with inflation. So if you're using the dollar, you're financing American government. And that's why you shouldn't use the dollar. That's why I encourage people to have as much of their money in Bitcoin as possible, because the more you hold in dollars, the more you're providing value for the dollar, the more they're able to print and take that value away from you, which is A, impoverishing you, and B, enriching them and allowing them to do all of the horrific, violent, criminal things that they do all over the world.
We're here with Saifedean Ammous. We're going to talk about everything that's happening in Bitcoin, whether El Salvador is the place to go, what it's like to use Bitcoin with a lesser passport. There's so much we're going to talk about. We are here at Nomad Capitalist Live. It's our sold-out 4-day event. Make sure you're here with us next year in Kuala Lumpur. And Saifedean, welcome. You look great.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Andrew. It's a pleasure.
You are, you tell me, a nomad by birth.
Yes, I'm Palestinian and spent my life traveling around the world, lived in 4 continents and many countries, many cities, lost count.
Tell me how that works. Walk me through the progression from childhood to adulthood and traveling and where you lived.
All right, so I was born in the West Bank in Palestine. Then when I was about a year old, my family moved to Saudi Arabia, where my father worked as a doctor. Then he wanted to become a plastic surgeon, so he moved to Brazil, worked as a plastic surgeon in Brazil. Then after that, we moved back to the West Bank, to Ramallah, where my dad worked as a doctor. But a lot of our family is in Jordan, and we have Jordanian passports, which is what allows us to travel a lot more easily than if we didn't have it. Then I went to university in Lebanon, and then I did my master's in London, and then I did my PhD at Columbia University in New York. Then I went back and worked in Lebanon as a university professor. And then I've lived for a while in the US and Canada and Jordan, where I live right now.
Were you born as a Jordanian citizen? Or did
Yes,
that come later?
because people in the West Bank get
Right.
Jordanian citizenship. It's a little bit complicated. Up until the 80s, it was just regular Jordanian citizenship. Then it became a different kind of Jordanian citizenship. We were lucky that we kept the proper Jordanian citizenship, so we are Jordanians, and now I live in Jordan, and I love Jordan. I'm very happy to be there. It's a great place.
It's one of the countries we're talking about. It's a bit more of an outlier in the citizenship by investment world, but it's a passport that is available. Is there something that makes Jordan a good passport to have for maybe someone who's already Western but wants something very different for times of trouble?
Yeah, the great thing about Jordan is that it is very safe. It's a peaceful, safe society, which is great for raising a family. I think there are very few places in the world that are better for your family than Jordan. It's got a great mix in terms of allowing you to have a conservative culture where your kids aren't going to be exposed to all kinds of insanities that have become normalized in the West. You are very confident nobody's going to talk to your children about sex when they're 7, 8 years old. Nobody's going to try to explain to them about all these fetishes that they need to learn about, which this seems to be the only thing that people get taught in America these days. So it's a conservative culture, but at the same time, it's a free country where you can do whatever you want. So if you're a foreigner, you care about drinking, or if you want to party, it's not a society that is going to restrict you from that. So it's a very well-governed place. You have the freedom to be religious if you want. You have the freedom to not be religious. Alcohol is available if you care about that. And I think the best thing about it is that the royal family have done an incredible job of developing the country over the past century. I think the best way to think of it is this. When the Hashemite dynasty first came to Jordan, they were in Mecca initially. They came to Jordan in 1921. At that point, the population of Amman, the capital city of Jordan, was only 5,000 people. Oh. It was a tiny village that was just a stop on the road from Syria to Saudi Arabia. So pilgrims to Mecca would stop in Amman. And that was it. It was a small village, and the population was mainly, I think, or maybe entirely, Circassian. They were refugees who came from the south of Russia or Georgia, the Caucasus area in general. And after they had been massacred in Russia, they moved to different parts of the Ottoman Empire. And so there was a small town in the Jordanian desert, 1,000 meters above sea level, where 5,000 of them lived, and it was on the way to Mecca. And then the Hashemites come in, And today it's a city of 5 million people. And it's 5 million people who live with functioning infrastructure, 24-hour electricity, good sewage, good water. It's amazing.
Is that what the people in the West don't understand about Jordan? Because I was going on a deep dive about Jordan recently and the history, and without some of the resources that Saudi Arabia has, how they built this very well-respected, peaceful, rather prosperous place over time.
Yeah, absolutely. This is the thing. It's got the security of the Gulf countries, but it doesn't have the oil. It doesn't have the income. So it's a country who the previous king Hussein, he used to say, humans are the most precious resource we have. And this is something I think that is very true and very profound, because all other resources are just cheap matter that you can dig up from the ground. Humans truly are the most valuable thing. And I discuss this in detail in my third book, Principles of Economics, which explains economics and explains how the most valuable, most scarce resource is human time. And Jordan was an underpopulated region with very few people when the Hashemites came in. But then, because they ran the country so well, and because it was peaceful, because it respected people, they had millions of Palestinian refugees come in, and then Syrians and Iraqis come in. And today the country has a population, I think, of around 10 million people. And it's truly remarkable to think that a tiny little village has been transformed into a major global city. And the population of that city, this is the thing that people don't really understand, the population of that city is mostly refugees and Jordanians, and a lot of Jordanians who came from different parts of Jordan. So it's a new city, and these populations come in, Muslims and Christians, Palestinians and Jordanians, Iraqis and Syrians. They all get along. It's all peaceful. It's all quiet. It's a very, very good place. So over the last century, if you think of the Middle East, the most important thing people think of are the wars. And yet, if you lived in Amman, you've practically never had violent conflict. There was one episode in 1970 in Amman, but pretty much in the 100 years, there hasn't been any kind of
political violence. There's a shooting
violence.
Almost every day in the United States, unfortunately.
Absolutely.
Is that really so much different? So they treat you pretty well here in Malaysia, I imagine, as a Jordanian. You have that passport. And
yeah, you don't need a visa to come here.
It's pretty open to all, which is part of why we have the event here. How do you feel treated globally? Because I think of this, and I would imagine the average person would say, families from the West Bank. I'd like to get to in a moment what caused you to go back to the West Bank. People might not imagine that as well. But how do you get to go to the U.S. and Brazil and all these places? How did your family accomplish that?
You just need to apply for a visa. It's not that difficult. And a few years ago, my wife and I would consider the possibility of getting a Canadian passport. She had the permanent residency. She was very close to getting the Canadian passport. We just needed to spend more time there. And we also considered moving to the U.S., seriously thought about it. And
really?
Yeah, we considered moving, and we just decided it wasn't worth it.
The Canadian passport wasn't worth spending more time there?
Yeah.
Why was that? Because Jordan TRC passport, to your point, sure, you can get visas if you have a skill as your father had, a good job. If you have some wealth, you can do that. But I would imagine people would think, it'd be easier to be Tier A, Canadian. You can travel anywhere. You get all kinds of stuff.
But I mean, really.
What was the reason?
The reason is that applying for an American visa once every 4 or 5 years, and a Canadian visa once every 4 or 5 years, and a European visa once a year, because you get it for about a year when you start getting it regularly,
right,
is a lot easier and better and a lot less hassle than having to deal with all of the baggage that comes with these passports.
Really?
Yeah, with the American, of course, it's because of worldwide taxation.
Which will be in other countries eventually.
Exactly. So you have that in the case of Canada. And in the case of Canada, for us, I mean, if we just could take the passport and not have to worry about taxation, then it would be worth it. But securing the passport would have required us to spend a lot of time in Canada. And that was in the aftermath of COVID. And
you'd had enough.
Yeah, we were there and we were considering moving there. And then when COVID happened, we just decided communism is not for us. The healthcare system, a couple of experiences with the healthcare system in Canada were absolutely shocking. And so when we lived in Canada, the coping mechanism was, we were living on the border with the US. So
where was that?
In Windsor, Ontario.
Oh, okay, across from Detroit.
We tried being in Toronto for a while, but honestly, big cities in North America are just unlivable. They're so expensive.
So is Detroit, in all fairness.
Yeah, and Windsor is just across the river from Detroit, but it's a small town. It's safer, it's cleaner, it's a lot less stressful. And you have the big town if you needed to go to it, if you needed first.
You never had a problem in the U.S.
No, I have
Do
not.
they treat you well?
Yeah, I cannot complain. I did my graduate studies in Columbia University. I've never really felt any institutional racism or mistreatment because of my passport or where I am from, to be clear.
Right. So so you just said, I don't want that passport. It's not worth the time. And I would imagine because you're into Bitcoin and because you have your books and because you have all these different ways of making money, which are passive from a tax perspective, which could be in some cases more difficult. You just said, I will give up that great passport because I don't want to be here. The place doesn't have the values that I want. And it's probably going to cost me a lot of money, even though I can leave eventually. I still got to pay while I'm waiting.
Yes, exactly.
It wasn't worth it.
It was not worth it. And of course, also, so the healthcare was a major issue. And we thought we could cross the border. But then when COVID happened, they closed the border. And that's when you really felt suffocated because, well, what if my kids get sick? And my kids did get sick once. And we had to go to the communist hospital and wait for 18 hours with all of the methadone addicts who are waiting to get a free prescription. And then the other thing, of course, the real thing that really scared us, which was really what made us leave, is just hearing all those stories about how essentially in a place like Canada, your kids are not yours. Your kids belong to the government. You're just feeding them.
It takes a village.
Yeah, that stuff is really scary because, and I hear it, this has been getting worse. We've got friends and relatives, and they're also considering leaving Canada. I mean, we have some of my wife's relatives, her husband is a Syrian refugee who moved to Canada, and he's now considering moving away because his kids are being taught all kinds of ridiculous sexual garbage in school, and he's a conservative Muslim, and he doesn't want his kids to know about all these things at age 7, and I think that's very reasonable. I think the sooner you introduce kids to these concepts, the more likely it is for them to develop unhealthy understanding of those things. And of course, if you try and reject that, then you put yourself in the crosshairs.
Then you're unpopular.
Yeah, and more than just unpopular, you put yourself in the crosshair of the bureaucrats. And I mean, we also had an experience where my wife had a home birth, and she couldn't get a doula. There's a government-run system for having Canadian state doulas come and supervise birth. But of course, like everything that's state-run, there's shortages. So she couldn't get a doula. But we'd had 2 kids before. We'd had 2 home births with a doula. So for the third one, she was okay to do it on her own, and she got an unregistered doula. I'm confessing to, well, I don't think it's a crime. She was just a friend who
Lock
came.
him up.
And then, we wanted to go and just register the baby, and it was a huge deal. The hospital reported us to Child Protection Services.
I would have thought you would have gone somewhere like what we talk about, like you go to Brazil and give birth and you get that passport. It says you had the experience growing up there. That would have been maybe a good one to get.
Yeah, but we primarily, it wasn't really about the passport. It was about being near my wife's mother so that she could be there for her during the birth. So the birth was very good. It was very smooth. The tricky part was convincing Child Protection Services that we weren't just negligent parents who inadvertently.
Isn't this the thing in the West? But you're the living embodiment of what we say, that not everybody wants to move to the U.S., wants to move to Canada, even though you're already there. You know what? Hey, you can keep your passport. It's not worth the price. But don't you think that in the West, there are these things where everything has to be more complicated than what it is in Jordan or where it is in Malaysia or what it is in probably almost the rest of the normal world? Why complicate it?
Yes, I think this is a very, very astute observation. I think it's just in the US and in these Western countries, and the way that I see it, because I see everything through the lens of money because of my books on Bitcoin and Fiat, I think it's just these governments have a lot more leeway in terms of printing money. So that allows them to finance themselves and to keep coming up with stupid ideas of things that they need to do, which comes at the expense of people's lives. And so they're just always coming up with new bureaucracies and new reasons for you to do things.
Unlike the rest of us, we all have to think about making sure we're making a living and making sure we're building our savings and protecting ourselves and protecting our assets. And we go up. These governments, right, they just push a button and they have the money and they don't have to worry. So they find other ways to stay occupied.
Exactly. And that just means more and more restrictions on your life. I think a good metric that I've recently begun using is whenever I want to think about what's going on in the country, and I did this coming to Malaysia just a couple of days ago, I look at the exchange rate of the currency against the US dollar over the last 20 years. That, I think, is a very, very important metric that you can't fake. If your currency has been stable against the US dollar for the last 20 years, that effectively means that your government has not been financing itself with inflation. You can't lie about that. If the government has been using money printing to finance itself, its currency is going to decline next to the dollar. If your government manages to keep the dollar rate stable over 20 years, that means the government is living off of taxes. And if a government has to live off taxes, it's a lot less wasteful and it's a lot more efficient. And so that, for me, is why I don't get the feeling in Jordan that these government employees are as much of a burden and as much of a parasite as they are in the US. Yeah, because I think when governments had to finance themselves with taxation, they run a budget. They have income and they have expenditure, and they need to be a little bit more careful than if they just have a magic money printer where they come up with an idea. Hey, wouldn't it be great to go finance this country fighting that country for a war because we've got some nice feelings about this country, and so let's go murder people. Well, in the US, you just click a button and all of that money materializes and you finance all kinds of carnage and all kinds of horrific things.
How much of your experience being from the West Bank and having that identity was what drove you into appreciation of Bitcoin?
Yeah, I think it's a big part of it. I think it's on an intellectual level, I would say that having grown up in a place that doesn't have a government was freeing in a sense, because I was not as subjected to government propaganda as most people are. So you grow up in a country, wherever you are in the world, there's a government, and they're out there from day one trying to pound it into your brain that you work for us, you need to do what we do.
We're the best.
We're the best. All the others are bad, and you should be privileged that you work and we get to take your money so that we can make your life better. And it's a very tough kind of conditioning to break out of. I think people have a lot of trouble breaking out of that. And I think also the other aspect of it, why it's helpful, sadly, is coming to the US in particular, seeing just how easy it is for media and for politicians to be completely dishonest or misinformed about reality. Because I grew up in the West Bank, I know what it was like. In the US, it's presented as if Israel is this innocent, civilized society that's just trying to live in peace and have modern civilization, whereas all of these barbarians keep attacking them because they just hate them because they're jealous. Of course, if you lived there, if you're familiar with reality rather than the version of reality that American media presents, you know that Israel has from day one, or even from before its establishment, it's been constantly stealing the land of Palestinians. The most important metric you should know is that all of the Zionists in Palestine owned around 5% of the country when the State of Israel was established. And but after the establishment of Israel, the government of Israel had owned something like 70% of the country. So you went from 5% in the hands of the Zionists, and mostly immigrants at that point, to 70%, because they kicked the majority of people out.
Isn't that what it is, though? I don't proclaim to be an expert in this topic, but I'll take the United States, for example. You mentioned the word jealousy. It's anyone who wants to come after us must be jealous, as the pretense to whatever we're going to do. And maybe those are the things that we're not here talking about. Maybe that is military. But it's the propaganda. It's the way people think that, hey, whatever the government says, oh, they're jealous of us for our freedom. And then you go to all the places that we're talking about, and you realize there's a pretty healthy amount of freedom there. And maybe not as much of it's written down, but maybe more of it is actually offered in practice. And you think, well, jealousy.
Yeah. No, I think this is very true. I think it's, if you travel around the Arab Gulf, it's really stark, the difference. I remember when I was a kid.
And for women too, because that's people think, oh, but you're speaking as a man.
No, for women too. I think one very interesting story is when I was a kid, I was growing up in Saudi Arabia in the 1980s. And I remember we would go to vacation to Europe and to the US. And I remember going from Al-Dammam, a small city in Saudi Arabia back then, to Chicago and New York and seeing the skyscrapers and being blown away by just how amazing it was. And that was in the mid-80s, 84 or 85 or so. And then I remember a few years ago, a friend of mine, her name is Natalie Brunel. She's a Bitcoiner and she runs a podcast and she's a journalist. She went to cover a Bitcoin conference in Dubai. And I saw her social media and the post that she was posting about it in Dubai. She lives in LA, or she lived in LA at that time. And it was shocking for me to realize that she went to Dubai and she was posting pictures from Dubai similar to how I would have gone to the US in the 1980s.
Back when Dubai was two camels.
Exactly. And at that point, LA, I mean, in the 80s, LA was what everybody in the world looked for. But if you've been to LA recently, it's a dumpster.
Was it ever as good as they said, do you think?
I don't know. I've not been, I mean, I didn't live in it extensively. I think I may have gone for a couple of days when I was a kid, but I don't really remember it. But it's definitely nowhere near as good as they think it is today. And I think I find it hilarious that Americans think that people are jealous of the Americans' way of life. Because realistically, if you live in Dubai, you pay very little taxes. You are safe. The streets are clean. You all have incredible services for everything.
Oh, but it's too hot. It's a little hot.
Yeah, well, there's air conditioning. And you can get into air conditioning, but you can't protect yourself.
What's that kind of the reason that you live in LA, by the way? Because it's kind of hot? Okay, it's not that hot. But
it's not that hot. It's not as hot as... Yeah, I mean...
I never understood this fascination with weather. It's too hot. It's too... Like this, it has to be within a 2-degree... Like that's the range we're accepting.
Yeah, and I mean, Dubai, okay, it's very hot in the summer, but the rest of the year, it's actually pretty pleasant. So for about 8 months of the year, it's
I grew up 6 months a year. It's bloody freezing and cold, and it's snowing and slushing, and people are killing each other and running into each other in the streets.
Yeah, no, that's not fun. I've lived in North America. It's very, very cold. But putting the weather aside, the most important thing for me is, in terms of quality of life, is your safety and your ability to own your property. And taxes are a big part of that. Taxes are just the theft of your property. So living in a place like LA or San Francisco or Chicago or New York today, you're paying about half of your income in taxes, depending on your income, depending on the state taxes. But you're paying something like half. You go to Dubai, you go to Qatar, you go to the Arab Gulf, you pay somewhere between 0 and 3% or something like that. And that's,
if you're in Bitcoin, maybe a little bit more if you're an entrepreneur, as they raise the corporate tax. But for Bitcoin, still.
Yeah, still it's
good deal.
It's a tiny fraction of what you'd pay there. And you get safe streets. You can walk around. You don't have to worry about your kids getting abducted every 5 minutes. It's incredibly safe. And it's amazing how they've done that. And I think it's my explanation for it, which I discuss in my last book, Principles of Economics, is that ultimately places that have to compete for citizens are like businesses. So even though it's a government and you don't think of a government as a business, but the Gulf countries are businesses. They've had to compete for the majority of their workforce for the past 50, 60 years. Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, Kuwait, Qatar, Bahrain, Oman, these countries, the majority of their residents are foreigners. So they needed to attract talent from Europe, from the US, from South Asia, from Africa, from all over the world. And so that means they must offer something attractive. Nobody forces anybody in Dubai.
They didn't have anybody. They had to build it from scratch. And 20 years ago, it was a punchline. Dubai was a punchline. Much the same way a Kia 20 years ago was a punchline. And they just, like a business, they just kept building it up. How do we repair the brand? What do we need to fix? What do we need to do? Who do we need to bring in? Who's the expert? You don't see that in the legacy brand countries.
No, absolutely not. This is the thing. They've had to compete for it, and they managed to do it. There are a lot of Emirates in the Emirates itself, the United Arab Emirates, as well as the rest of them, and they're out there competing with one another. They need to attract everything from the top talent in engineering and medicine, all the way down to the manual workers that they bring in.
What are your thoughts on this? Because I imagine there are plenty of, I know you're a Bitcoin guy, but in the broader crypto world, there are no doubt a bunch of let's call it unethical people. And obviously those people deserve to be dealt with appropriately. But I would also imagine that when you look at the West, and every day it seems like the SEC is going after this guy or that guy, I imagine some of those people must just be pioneers who didn't check the right box on a form, because somehow, if they were doing it in the UAE and the US had nothing to do with it, I feel like they'd be welcomed rather than castigated. Am I wrong on that?
No, I think it's true. I think these countries are much more secure in a sense because they've got an enormous amount of savings and they have a secure country. They are, I believe, more willing to tolerate risk, to tolerate experimentation in economic terms.
Because they want to compete. They want to be the next big place for whatever.
Yeah, and you know what Dubai did, which was really very smart, is that they basically copied the commercial law of Hong Kong, which was copied from Britain, from the city of London. And so it's a set of ways of managing commercial law that has evolved over hundreds of years at the epicenter of global capitalism, where London had developed these codes over, common law tradition over hundreds of years to suit the needs of business. And Dubai copied that. And that's why people from all over the world want to get headquartered in Dubai today. And I think that's a lot more conducive to business than what you're seeing in the legacy of countries where the money printer just allows them to continuously treat their people as cattle to be sheared rather than as resources to be developed.
Whenever they go out and put out more debt, or whenever they go do it, hey, yeah, we got these, they'll pay taxes eventually. Recently, we'll jack it up.
Yeah,
and then they come out and then the politicians come out. Oh, it's because it's so unfair. But in reality, we racked up a bunch of debt. We don't know how to run anything. We don't know how to run a business or balance a budget. So now we're going to shame you for our mistake.
Yeah, and it's amazing that they present this as the value proposition. Well, we've got millions of people who we can force at gunpoint to pay taxes. That's not a very attractive business model.
Right, that's what you're buying into.
Yeah.
Right.
We're going to extort millions of people in order to make sure that we can pay off our debt, which isn't really attractive because,
it's not attractive to be one of those people.
Exactly. So this, I think, is also leading to an extreme form of adverse selection in terms of who the people who want to go to these countries are. So I remember around the same time when my wife and I were considering moving to Canada and the US, we had one of my wife's friends, Canadian. She's married to a Lebanese guy who's, let's just say, not the most ambitious kind of person, not the most productive kind of person, doesn't really have much going on. And so we were considering and we were discussing it, and it was an entirely different thought process. For me, I'm thinking, wow, those taxes are enormous. I need to figure out if I'm going to move there, how do I make sure that I don't end up paying so much in taxes? Whereas for him, it was a great bargain because he's just going to go there, relax, smoke legal weed, and have the state pay for him and his children. So it makes a lot more sense for him to move there than it does for somebody who's planning on being productive.
And maybe as I get older, I say, I don't agree with that, but you know what? He's going to do what he's going to do, whether I like it or not. But why isn't it that somehow when we do what we want to do, it's viewed differently? And I would imagine that, and I think this is a big issue with Bitcoin, is so many people got so wealthy by getting into Bitcoin early that it's one of those things that politicians can now just say, oh, look at you guys, you got lucky, and these people over here didn't. And why don't you just pay us more?
Yeah, I think we're likely to be seeing that. And I think the answer to your question is why is it that choice isn't shamed, whereas the choice of wanting to keep the money that you've earned is shamed, is because the majority of media and intellectual discourse, universities, it's all state funded. It's all government.
They can be controlled.
Yeah, and yeah, exactly. So if you're going there and you're choosing to go live on welfare, that's great. You've just given the state another peon. You've more reason for spending money, more reason for taking taxes. If you're going there to be productive and trying to get out of paying taxes legally, then you're taking power away from the state, and that's not very conducive. And so that's why media and academia are much more favorable to the first kind of example than the second.
I mentioned on stage last night that as, whether it's loss of the power of sanctions, marginal continual losses of world reserve currency, whatever it is, anything we're talking about, as the legacy brand countries, the US being the biggest, lose little marginal pieces of power, they're going to have to become more and more aggressive. Like a tiger, you corner, and it has to eventually just come out and attack you. What do you think about that?
I think that's the case, yeah. I think, this is also borne out by experience. The last few decades, you see tax rates constantly going up, government spending constantly going up. To borrow a phrase, there's no stopping this train. It's the incentives are baked in at the political level.
It's too late, probably.
Yeah, I think it's too late. I think we've probably reached a very important tipping point over the last year, which is that the interest expense on the national debt has overtaken the defense budget. And the defense budget, and the defense budget is enormous. A lot of people are being killed by enormously expensive American weapons around the world.
By the defense.
By the defense, exactly. A lot of innocent people all over the world are getting killed with extremely expensive weapons. These bombs that are being thrown at Lebanon and Gaza, they're being thrown at houses that are worth $50,000. You're throwing a $5 million bomb and it's killing 20 people.
Why would you, if that were the case, and I've thought about this, why would you want to be American at some point? Why would you want to live there?
I think if I were to make the case for it, I still think if you had a startup, I think that's probably the best case I could come up with. If you had a startup and you're looking for funding, probably being in America is a great place to secure funding, to secure venture capital for early stage, and probably to list on IPO. It's because it's the biggest, deepest.
Don't those things just seem like a different variety? Maybe I'm thinking small. Those things always seem like their own form of control. I don't want to be my own boss. So I'm going to raise money so I can basically have a new boss, or I'm going to have the average person buying shares of my stock. I mean, look at the Trump media stock with all the retail investors buying that. It's down 30% in a week sometimes.
No, I agree. I think
I'd say start a business in Dubai and don't take the funding.
Exactly. I mean, I bootstrap my own business, my website where I teach my courses. I just decided from day one I'm going to generate enough income to manage my costs.
So much more sustainable that way, don't you think?
Yeah, and I don't have to report to people all the time. I can just do what I want, and I need to report for myself. Obviously, there are advantages to working with venture capital, working with people who have experience with this thing. So I don't completely dismiss it, but. That, for me, is the best case for why you would want to be in the U.S. And I know several people who've moved there for that reason.
Could you live with yourself, though? If you said, I'm going to become an American citizen because you lived there, would you feel at odds knowing that you are against how that money is spent?
Yeah, the moral aspect of it is very heavy. Although, to be fair, realistically, the U.S. government doesn't just rob American citizens in order to finance itself. It robs the entire planet with inflation. So if you're using the dollar, you're financing American government. And that's why you shouldn't use the dollar. That's why I encourage people to have as much of their money in Bitcoin as possible, because the more you hold in dollars, the more you're providing value for the dollar, the more they're able to print and take that value away from you, which is A, impoverishing you, and B, enriching them and allowing them to do all of the horrific, violent, criminal things that they do all over the world.
As a Jordanian citizen who has Bitcoin, who has wealth, do you feel more secure then from, hey, Jordan's not going to come and tax me if I live in Dubai? Do you feel better than, let's say, an American who already has that issue, or a Canadian or an Australian who might? Is Jordan less likely to go down that road?
I think so. I think Jordan's not exactly very low taxes, but they don't tax you on foreign income, and they don't tax you if you're living abroad on your income.
So when you move out to Dubai, it's all right, have a nice day.
Yeah, exactly. So they're taxing you really for the activities that are taking place. And in general, I think maybe this is me looking at the bright side, but you see, for instance, custom duties in Jordan are usually being brought down. It's one place where you see these things are declining over time rather than going up. And overall, I think I'm very happy with the package. I think the fact that my kids can just play in the street, go to visit the neighbors, is enormously valuable. I think the fact that they don't have to suffer from going to school and being subjected to all kinds of insane propaganda is enormously valuable. These two things on their own, I struggle to see how you can get them obviously you can still get them in the US to an extent if you live in small communities, tight-knit communities.
There's still a federal government.
There's still a federal government, and also it's difficult for foreigners to get into those.
That is true, and I think a lot of what I've talked to a lot of Bitcoiners are single guys who are looking to date, and they're like, there's probably a better opportunity somewhere else, and she probably can't come here. I've had that a lot. Let's talk about El Salvador. I know you were at Bitcoin Beach recently. What are your thoughts on what they're doing with Bitcoin? And
I'm a huge fan of El Salvador and a huge fan of President Bukele. I think he's been doing a tremendous job. It's truly a miracle. El Salvador was the murder capital of the world up until a few years ago. He took over, and now it is the safest country in the Western Hemisphere, safer than the US, safer than Canada, on course this year. Crime statistics by the end of the year, unless something drastic happens, the US gets its act together or El Salvador breaks out into violence.
US is in the bottom half of safe countries in the world for violent crime.
Yeah, well, the Western Hemisphere is generally a lot more unsafe. So El Salvador is now, I think, the safest country in the Western Hemisphere. So this has been an incredible transformation. But also add to that the fact that President Bukele has been buying Bitcoin and he's accumulating Bitcoin, which I find to be enormously valuable. I think a lot of the people have had a misconception about Bitcoin. They think of it as being a replacement for Visa credit cards, or a replacement for Western Union, or a replacement for Venmo or PayPal. And what I argue in my book, The Bitcoin Standard, which I think is what made the book successful, is that I presented the case for it as not being a payment technology, but being a financial asset. And therefore, it's not out there competing with Visa and PayPal, because Visa and PayPal can just use Bitcoin. Visa supports 150
You can get
currencies.
a PayPal account with Bitcoin.
Yes, and Visa has 150 currencies, so adding one more is not a major issue. What Bitcoin is up against is the central banks to produce the reserve assets, to produce the financial assets that the world uses.
Against gold, would you say?
Against gold, against the dollar, against, and I think most importantly, the real final boss that Bitcoin is up against is government bonds. Because government bonds are what people use as the base of their financial portfolio. It's the part that that you think is least risky, and that doesn't offer you a lot of returns, but it offers you the least riskiness. Well, Bitcoin is proving itself a lot less risky than government bonds, and if you study it from a technical perspective, you realize it's a lot better, and it's outperforming government bonds. It's not even in the same league. Government bonds have gone down 20, 30, 40% over the last few years. Bitcoin's gone up about 50% per year over the last 5 years or so. So people who are holding Bitcoin are witnessing their balance sheet get healthier, and people who are holding government bonds are witnessing their balance sheet get devastated. And that's what's so interesting about El Salvador, which is that the president is accumulating more and more Bitcoin. They're buying a Bitcoin every day, and that Bitcoin is accumulating wealth as it's growing in value.
It's a different kind of sovereign wealth fund almost.
Yes, and I think the interesting thing is if you keep extrapolating this over the next 5 years, everybody who's got US government bonds is going to be worse off. Their assets are going to be less valuable, and their government is going to be financed. And it's going to have financial problems because your assets are being devalued, your government bonds are becoming worthless, whereas El Salvador is having its balance sheet increase. And Bitcoin's gone up tremendous amounts. So they've held it now for 3 years. Maybe the next year we get a major bull run, and then that completely transforms El Salvador's expenses. And what President Bukele said they're going to do next year is that they're not going to have a budget deficit. They're going to run a budget surplus. So now if you start running a budget surplus and you stop borrowing and you start accumulating Bitcoin, the entire model of government in the 21st century is going to be different from the model of government in the 20th century. The 20th century was all about governments borrowing as much as they can, creating as much inflation as they can, and taxing as much as they can. All of that comes down to the fact that they just can't have a good form of money that would hold value. Now they have a good form of money that can hold value over time. Governments are going to switch. I think the most successful governments are going to do what Bukele is doing, which is we don't want debt. We don't want to have our citizens taxed to pay interest on the national debt. Instead, we're going to keep accumulating hard assets that are going to keep appreciating, and we are going to spend less than we earn.
What do you say to people who say Bukele is buying Bitcoin as a publicity stunt only?
Well, if you have, they've made, I think, hundreds of millions of dollars so far in terms of appreciation. So
it's a good stunt.
Yeah, that's a very good stunt. If you know other stunts that can make such returns, then I'd be very happy to engage in them. It's really changing the health of the Salvadoran government's balance sheet in spite of the opposition of the IMF, which is now, they've softened their stance because they said initially, oh, this is reckless, this is dangerous, they shouldn't do it. And now here they are. It's worked out for them a lot better than doing whatever else the IMF asked them to do.
Well, everyone we've interviewed, heads of state, everybody who has basically done the opposite of what the IMF said, and it ended up working out pretty well for them.
Yes, it's a good way to go in life.
I imagine what people who are buying those U.S. government bonds would say is, well, hey, this has worked for so long. And number one, that's why I'm going to keep buying the bonds. But more importantly, hey, this El Salvador thing, he turned it around in a couple of years. What's to say it stays that way? What maybe the next guy ruins it? And there's this idea that somehow, no matter who gets elected in a Western country, it'll be great. The institutions will stand up. But in El Salvador, how do you know if you've turned the corner? And how do you know that?
Obviously everything is possible. Who knows? But I think the likelihood that it turns around is very, very low because, first of all the criminals are in jail, so there's very little crime. So somebody needs to take the criminals out.
That was their problem.
Yeah.
Too much crime.
Too much crime. They locked up a big number of people, but they freed up millions of people. As he said, Bukele said at the UN, people think we took the freedom of thousands of people. No, we gave freedom to millions of people. The people of El Salvador, and if you go there, and I encourage people to go there, it's a beautiful country. It's an amazing country. It's mountains and volcanoes, tropical forests right on the Pacific. Amazing, amazing nature. And you go there and you just think, wow, this place is really, really underdeveloped. And you wonder why. And then you think, oh yeah, well, because for the last 20, 30 years, nobody could leave their house without worrying about getting murdered. Everybody was stuck at home all the time because they were fearful. And then you think, okay, well, now that's gone. So your immediate thinking is, wow, there's going to be another 10x here. I mean, just thinking about tourist resorts, thinking about infrastructure projects, the country's so behind because of lack of investment over the last 40 years that if you provide the security that's going to bring in that investment, you can see the country growing enormously. There's just an enormous amount of potential ahead of it. So, and of course, he's enormously popular. He just won re-election. And it's extremely unlikely that people are going to vote him out. I mean, even his opposition admit that, yeah, he's done a much better job than we have. So he's securing them financially, securing them in terms of physical security. And I think they're going to be re-electing him, or if he chooses to not run again, then they'll probably elect somebody very similar to him, somebody he supports, somebody who's going to carry on the process. And I think Bitcoin is going to help make this sustainable because, as I discuss in my work in the Bitcoin standard and in the Fiat standard, I think Bitcoin, because it's money that appreciates over time, completely changes the way that people approach everything in life. If your money is depreciating over time, the future is insecure, you become a lot more present-oriented, you have a very high discounting rate for the future. You're more likely to engage in reckless behavior that endangers you for the future. You're more likely to engage in criminal behavior, immoral behavior, uncivilized, antisocial behavior, because you don't care about long-term consequences, because the future is not available. There's no easy way for you to provide for your future. When you have a hard money, as people did under the gold standard, I believe people were more civilized in some societies that had a gold standard than we do in societies that run on fiat money. That's why crime is up, I think. Ultimately, the moral problem is rooted, in my opinion, in money. Once money is devalued, once money is being destroyed, then people find it very hard to provide for their future. And therefore, they discount the future more and they behave in much more destructive ways. So I think as El Salvador stacks more Bitcoin, I think everybody in the country, from the president down to the pupusa stand, they're going to become more future-oriented. They're going to become more peaceful, more civilized, and I believe it's a pretty sustainable improvement, and I hope it continues.
They really, in the Western media, pick on him, and I remember he posted, "Oh, there's riots in the street in Paris. The military's out, and things are burning down." Imagine if this happened in San Salvador, what people would be saying.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's a real double standard.
Remarkable. It really is, absolutely. And it's quite revealing, I think, of the way in which the power structure of the world works. And I think it's truly astounding because you have this government that has managed to do something good. Out of all the governments in the world, I can't think of many that have done good things over the last few decades. This guy managed to make people in the country secure. And if you just talk to any Salvadoran, they're just so thrilled about how their life has changed. I mean, it's to the point where people are now moving to smaller houses because they had to live in big houses before because everybody in the family was always at home because you couldn't leave. Well, now people can leave. People can go play basketball in the courts, in the public courts. People can go to the beach. People can walk around in the town. So life has improved drastically. You'd think they'd be happy about it, and yet they're not. Whereas you look at people who run hellholes like San Francisco and LA, and you look at Gavin Newsom, for instance, he's treated like
royalty.
Like royalty.
They retire, they get awards.
Exactly. He's always being feted and he's always being treated. And of course,
feted is an underutilized word, I think.
Yes. and it's happening as California is disintegrating. And of course, there are many other places we could mention. But it suggests that there is an interest in having crime. And I think you can sort of see why the incentive is there for it. If you have societies that are falling apart, if people can't invest because of crime, if you destroy people's ability to have a functioning society around them, if you destroy and undermine the family, you destroy and undermine society, well, what does that mean? It means people are poor, people are desperate, people are broke, And what do those people need in order to meet their day-to-day expenses? They need debt.
And they certainly can't, or don't think they can, leave and go somewhere else, and they don't want to be open to the place that is the untrusted brand. So they stay in the place, oh, it's been good for 250 years, not realizing everything rises and falls. Real quick, Bitcoin Beach, you were there. What's going on in El Zonte, is it?
Yeah.
You're down there is it with Max Kaiser?
Yes, I was there with Max and Stacy. It's a beautiful, beautiful place. It's amazing.
Is he wearing the orange shoes still?
Always, I think. And it's attracting a lot of tourists from all over the world, particularly Bitcoiner tourists. And I think Bitcoiners are becoming a significant part of the tourism income of El Salvador, because it's really put the country on the map for Bitcoiners. And because of the way the Bitcoin appreciates, Bitcoiners generally tend to have a lot of disposable income. So it's probably a demographic that has a lot more money to spend than other demographics.
And more time flexibility in many cases.
And more time flexibility. A lot of Bitcoiners just don't need to be in the office 24/7, like, well, not 24/7, but like, as much as regular Fiat debt slaves need to.
What's the best hotel in El Zonte? Where would you stay?
Well, I stayed in a very nice place called the Garten, the Garten Hotel. It's a small place. I think it's only 5 rooms or so, but it's right on the beach. They've got a great restaurant, and they have surf lessons there. So if you don't know how to surf, it's a great place to go. I took my first surf lessons there.
And you're still here to talk about it. We'll have to go to Oman. We'll have to do a Live Like a King in Oman at some point.
Yes, absolutely. We'd love to have you. We should maybe do a conference there. It's a great place to have conferences. They've got a lot of nice venues.
Real Jordanian.
Yeah, they've got a good airline, and airlines is another way in which you realize how low the U.S. has sunk. I mean, the difference between American airlines, not just American Airlines, but all the U.S.-based airlines.
Even Southwest now, they say. They say even Southwest has gone to the dogs.
Yeah.
Who knows?
Yeah, I haven't been on that one, but the ones that I've been on, I mean, there's a huge difference between them and the Gulf Airlines and the Arab Airlines. And we've got Petra as well, the Dead Sea. You got to float in the Dead Sea, and you got to see Petra. It's an incredible city that's all carved in stone. Should do the next conference in Amman.
Oh, we'll take it under advisement. Saifedean Ammous, good to see you here at Nomad Capitalist Live. Thank you.